Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Penn Vicarage on this Thursday morning. Lovely to see you. Thank you, as always, for joining us for our Bible talk for today as we continue our adventure through the incredible book of Psalms. Today's psalm, my friends, is Psalm 132, and which continues with what's called Songs of Ascents, which were between 120 and 134, which are psalms of pilgrimage used by pilgrims as they went on their way to Jerusalem. And all of them have a slightly different take on the pilgrim's journey, what they might have been going through as they went on this pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And people to this day, lots of people still go on pilgrimages today to find places where they can be particularly close to God. And these pilgrims used to go to Jerusalem. And today's psalm is Psalm 132. Here goes. O Lord, remember in David's favour all the hardships he endured. How he swore to the Lord and vowed to the mighty one of Jacob, I will not enter my house or get into my bed. I will not give sleep to my eyes or slumber to my eyelids until I find a place for the Lord, a dwelling place for the mighty one of Jacob. We heard of it in Ephrathah. We found it in the fields of Jair. Let us go into his dwelling place. Let us worship at his footstool. Rise up, O Lord, and go to your resting place, you and the ark of your might. Let your priests be clothed with righteousness. Let your faithful shout for joy. For your servant David's sake, do not turn away the face of your anointed one. The Lord swore to David a sure oath, from which he will not turn back. One of the sons of your body I will set on your throne. If your sons keep my covenant and my decrees that I shall teach them, their sons also forevermore shall sit on your throne. For the Lord has chosen Zion and desired it for his habitation. This is my resting place forever. Here I will reside, for I have desired it. I will abundantly bless its provisions. I will satisfy its poor with bread. Its priests I will clothe with salvation, and its faithful will shout for joy. There I will cause a horn to sprout up for David. I have prepared a lamp for my anointed one. His enemies I will clothe with disgrace, but on him his crown will gleam. And this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Okay, this psalm is widely thought to be connected with the arrival of David when David brought the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem or Zion for the first time. And it could have been for the very first time, but it doesn't say Song of David. So I think more likely, when pilgrims used to go to Jerusalem, they'd kind of reenact it. I suppose you see it to this day these days, like, when we reenact Christmas by having nativity plays, don't we? We reenact passion plays at Easter, this type of thing. And I think in some ways, as the pilgrims were going towards Jerusalem, they may have reminded themselves of the triumphal entry of the Ark of the Covenant by David when he took it into Jerusalem for the first time. And I think in a sense that's what they were focusing on, that's what they were reminding themselves of. There was sort of reenacting, and as friends, as you're coming into Jerusalem now, remember the time when David, and I think it kind of, that's my take on it, is when they come into Jerusalem as pilgrims, that's what they would encounter. And at this point, they would be kind of reliving the time when David, as I say, brought the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem, that great big treasure chest which they had. They had the Ark of the Covenant. In it there were various things, including the Ten Commandments and one or two other things which they used to carry around. And as I say, when David brought it into Jerusalem for the first time, I think it's 2 Samuel chapter 6, I think you find it, this is what happens. And I think, as I say, this is what pilgrims were doing when they read this psalm. They were reenacting that great arrival. And the psalm essentially is in two bits. There is verses 1 to 10, and there is 11 to the end. So there's verses 1 to 10, and there's 11 to the end. And the first, we'll do in one section at a time. Verses 1 and 10 are surrounded by little petitions. So, verse 1, O Lord, remembering David's favour, the hardships he endured. And verse 10, very similar. For your servant David's sake, do not turn away the face of your anointed one. So you've got verses 1 and 10 kind of surrounding it with a couple of petitions here. Then he goes on to talk about, remember, O Lord, in David's favour, all the hardships he endured, how he swore to the Lord and vowed to mighty one to Jacob, I will not enter my house, and so on and so on and so on. And there's been all sorts of speculations as to what those hardships may have been. There was one occasion when they weren't carrying the ark properly and it slipped, and somebody called Perez, beg your pardon, Uzzah, tried to stop it falling, and Uzzah got basically sort of, there was there was kind of he kind of died on the spot, and they thought that could have given David some distress. It could be also the battles he fought and so on. I'm not sure that it was. My version on this one, I think, is more about the zeal that he felt. David was passionately devoted to God, and David was desperately keen that the ark should be given a proper resting place, and so on and so on and so on. And I think what David suffered from really here, what they're talking about, is David's zeal for God. David was passionate. He was enthusiastic. He was desperate for God's kingdom. He was desperate to do things God's way. He was desperate that God should be given the honor that God deserves, and it didn't always happen. And I think David found that very painful. You get something similar with Elijah, who was zealous for the Lord God, but of course he was the only person in the land that was, and he took on the prophets of Baal and so on. And I think when Elijah met God, I have been zealous for the Lord my God. And I think what it is here really, I think David was passionate about God. And I think God didn't always get the honour that God deserved, and I think David struggled with that. And I think the pain, the hardships that David endured were really to do with that he was zealous for God and he was desperate for God's will to happen. And actually, I think we can learn from that today. How we can be how we also need to be zealous for the Lord God as well. And prior to this, you see things like verses 6 and 7. We heard of it in Ephrathah. We found it in the fields of Jair. One translation has Jair as basically like a forest area. And let us go to your dwelling place. Let us worship at his footstool. Let us go was often, I think it's referring here to when the ark used to be taken into battle. And I think what David's saying here is, we've been keeping the ark in the forest, out in the open, you might say. The ark's been used for taking into battle. It's about time that the ark was given a proper resting place. And David, in his zeal for God, in his enthusiasm, in his passion for God, longs to see that happen. And I think that's what the psalmist is saying here. Remember for David the pains he endured. It was pains out of zeal. Then in the rest of the psalm, verses 11 to the end, it's all about the covenant. Verse 11 to 12 is the promise that God has made to his people. And the response is, if your sons keep my covenant and my decrees that I shall teach them, their sons also shall sit in your throne forevermore. So it's really about the covenant, the promise, the agreement, if you like, God made with his people. That he swore to David, a promise he will never return, that one of your sons will sit on your throne, but the sons need to keep close to me as well. And I think really that's what the verse 11 and 12 really are talking about, God's promise and what the people's response to be. God promises he'll bless his people, but in response, the people need to be true to God as well. And then I think for the pilgrims, what they are reenacting here, for the Lord has you can imagine as they enter Zion, as they enter Jerusalem, for the Lord has chosen Zion, he's designed it for his habitation. This is my dwelling place forever. Here I will reside, for I've decided. You can almost imagine the pilgrims walking into Jerusalem saying, hey friends, this is it. This is the place. This is the place where it's all about. God, this is it, folks. This is where David was. And you imagine the sense of excitement as this is the place, friends. And then finally at the end, he does say, beg your pardon, in verse 11, he does one final thing to say. The Lord swore to David a sure oath from which you will not turn back. One of the sons of your body I will set on your throne. And again, there's a couple of ways of taking this. It could be talking about the descendants of David like Solomon, who did, and so on, God's promise. But it's also, of course, David's son, of course, we're talking about Jesus, a descendant of David, one of David's children, one of David's offspring, who of course did reign and does reign and is now King of Kings and Lord of Lords and reigns supreme over all things. So one of David's sons does sit on God's throne, and he did keep the covenant, and he will sit on our throne forevermore. And he is our King of Kings. He is our friend, and he is with us today. So friends, two sections in here. Imagine this lovely pilgrim song, verses 1 to 11, talking here about the zeal David had, enthusiasm. And let's ask God to give us the passion for God as well today. Then there's the promise in verses 11 and 12 that God will bless his people, but in response, the people need to be faithful to God in return as well. And that God promises that one day he will set one of his on his throne. And of course it was Solomon immediately after, and they had some few bad kings after that. But of course one of David's offspring does. His name is Jesus. He does reign at God's right hand, and he is our King forevermore. Friends, bless you. I hope that's helpful. It's a complicated psalm, this one. I hope I made some sense of it for you. Psalm 132. Read it again at your leisure. Imagine the pilgrims. Imagine entering Jerusalem. Imagine hearing God's promise. We need to be reminding of God's promise to us. Let's be faithful to him. And let's know that his offspring, David, does reign, and he's our King today. Bless you, my